Great. So thank you everyone for joining this London Policy and Strategy Network session today on this, well, at least it's sunny in London, sunny but cold. And we're really delighted to have Helen Flynn, the Head of Policy Campaigns and Research for Just Fair, who's going to talk to us about tackling socio-economic inequality kind of with local authorities and the socio-economic duty. I won't steal her thunder and say kind of anything more either about her organisation or about the duty. But kind of what I will say is it's the first time we've got Helen and a representative from Just Fair. So yeah, do check them up. Kind of they do kind of wider work as well as the issue that we're going to kind of focus on today. And I think a really important session, kind of when we're kind of reflecting on kind of the inequalities that have arisen from the pandemic, and when we see kind of the inflation and unemployment and other issues really exacerbate some existing inequalities as well as some invisible ones as well. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Helen, who's going to talk more about the issue. Hello, Helen.
Hello, thank you. I'm just going to try and pull up my presentation. So anyway, while we're waiting for that to load, oh, there we go. As Noel said, firstly, thanks Noel for inviting me here and having me here to speak. My name's Helen Flynn. You might be able to hear from the accent that I'm from Northern Ireland, and I'm currently coming to you from Northern Ireland today because that's where I live and work, because Just Fair was a London-based charity for the first 10 years of our life, but then over the pandemic we switched to remote working, so all of our staff work remotely. In terms of Just Fair's focus, we focus on social, economic and cultural rights. And by that, it can be a kind of like, this is the thing with human rights law, it can be really like jargon heavy. But when I talk about social and economic rights, what I talk about is often that they're the rights for everyday life. So you're talking about things like healthcare, education, just and favourable conditions of work. The things that actually a lot of the time when people are thinking about human rights, that's kind of what they're talking about. So I am going to talk today about the guide that we produced. You can see that we produced it in coalition with a lot of organisations. In fact, it's a whole slide full of organisations. And don't worry about taking any notes today. I should say Noel's going to send the slides around afterwards. The slides are very information heavy because I don't like people having to take notes. I just like you to be able to listen. So just to get into the presentation, what we're going to talk about today, before we get into that guide for how you might practically implement the socioeconomic duty, I wanted to do a bit of context and talk about inequality in the UK, why it matters. Then I'll look at the socioeconomic duty and where that sits in law. Now we'll get into the guide with those practical steps to implement the duty. And any questions, pop them in the chat, although I have gotten a little bit more used to using Zoom for presentations, so it's been a while since I've used Teams. So first slide is about inequality in the UK. Why is it a problem and where does it come from and how can we reduce it? To put it most simply, inequality is a gap between those with the least resources and those with the most. And despite high levels of wealth in the UK, we're actually one of the most unequal societies in the developed world. There's some statistics there. Again, I'll be sending the slides around, and this is very much just an overview session because we have less than an hour, because I promise you'll be done by 2. So I'm just going to do a quick skim through, but you will get the slides as a resource. But for example, back in 2019, the Sunday Times Rich List, the richest 1,000 people were comfortably richer than the poorest 40% of households combined in the UK. And it had particular impacts during COVID-19, where individuals from the lowest socioeconomic groups were 1.5 times more likely to lose work and more than 7 times more likely to be able to, or to be unable to pay bills. If, by the way, I'm speaking too quickly or my accent's too thick, just say to me and I'll slow down and try and speak a little more clearly. So that's inequality, which is a national problem, but it does have a regional face. So across the UK, London has the highest rate of in-work poverty. And further, this is some statistics from a recent Joseph Rowntree Foundation report, which found that in 2019, London had the largest ethnicity pay gap, with minority ethnic groups earning 23.8% less than white employees. And about the lowest paid employees are paying on average 51% of their income for rent alone, which to me was pretty shocking, but then I come from Northern Ireland where rents are a lot lower. And the other thing that's really important when we think about the pandemic that we're still struggling with is that research by Inside Housing showed that coronavirus deaths were highest in local authorities with the highest rates of overcrowding and the largest prevalence of houses with multiple occupation. That was particularly in London boroughs where overcrowding was especially high. And by April 2020, 18 of the 20 local authorities with the highest death rates were in London, and the worst affected also tended to have large BAME populations, which unfortunately included Newham. So why does this matter though? Because we all know that inequality is bad, we all know that poverty is bad, but what's also important is that it's not just bad for the individual's experience in it, it's actually bad for everybody in society. So we often talk about this research that was conducted by Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson in a book called The Spirit Level. And what that book did was that when it looked around the world, it found that when you compare issues such as teen pregnancy, infant mortality, violent crime, physical and mental health and education outcomes, these all get worse in societies with higher rates of inequality. So in other words, inequality hurts us all, not just the economically excluded. Although I imagine you're all here today because you already have a good amount of insight into that. So then, just to talk about the socio-economic duty, because my background is law and I like to situate it in legislation because it gives me a kind of foundation about what I'm talking about. The socio-economic duty is found in Section 1 of the Equality Act 2010, which applies to England, Scotland and Wales. It requires public authorities to consider how the exercise of their powers can reduce inequality. It's very similar to the public sector equality duty in Section 149 of the Act, which requires public authorities to consider the need to eliminate discrimination and foster good relationships between communities when exercising their functions. But the problem is that while Section 1 has been enacted by Parliament into law, it requires an extra action, which is that a Minister of the Crown must make a commencement order before it takes effect, and that commencement order has still not been done. But what we're here to talk about today is that even though it's not yet a legal obligation in England, that doesn't prevent local authorities, health authorities, even the police from viewing it as good practice and adopting it voluntarily and locally as part of its practice. And so to our guide, which I will send round to Noel so that he can distribute to people if you're interested in reading that afterwards. It's a fairly short document. The idea behind creating it was that people would actually use it. It's only 12 pages in length. And what it does is it lays out what implementing the socio-economic duty means in practice. It highlights 6 key practical steps that local authorities can take. And then it also highlights the benefits that implementation can have. Just to highlight some of those benefits, firstly, sorry, I've kind of lost my place. The idea that some of the benefits include that it can improve local outcomes for local people who are experiencing socioeconomic disadvantage. We've heard from Newcastle City Council, who have had it implemented since 2012, that their combined, what they call, their integrated impact assessments, which includes the socioeconomic duty for them, help them look at council tax rises in a new way. So they actually created a fund and put aside money to help people who couldn't pay rises in council tax so they didn't become destitute. There's also supporting cross-organisation and cross-departmental working. I know if you're anything like the charity sector, the temptation to work in silos can be really high because it's handier that way, but we also do know that things work better when we're all working together and working across department. I also think there's a real value to naming a thing, and naming a thing being a really powerful tool in beginning to address it. So implementing the socioeconomic duty raises awareness of the inequalities and therefore makes it part of your consideration at all times. And that in itself is hugely powerful. It also, if you make it so, and I really would encourage people to make it so, can support participation of low-income residents in decisions that affect them. And that's particularly powerful in the context of all of us having to make cuts to services and how those are made in the most just possible way. And linked to the cross-organisational and departmental working, there's this idea that it can achieve greater consistency in practice, and not just about achieving the greater consistency, but also ensuring that the changes are made survive across changes in leadership or changes in staff, so that it doesn't just belong to one person and when they leave it's gone, but it's actually integrated and, as we talk about, mainstreamed throughout. And let you folks read these yourselves because I don't want to spend too much time on this because my time's quite limited today. But we've also, and I'll show you a quotation on the next slide, seen it as local authorities who have implemented report it as being a good way to help support the effective and efficient allocation of resources. Again, at a time when budgets are massively stretched, that's really important. So this is a quotation from a document we produced back in 2018 about the benefits of local adoption when we were kind of trying to encourage a lot more local authorities to get on board, and before, just as the Fair Scotland duty was coming in, because the socioeconomic duty is in force in Scotland, and this year it came into force in Wales as well. So when we interviewed people to talk about it, it was, of course, they reported that, yes, of course, it was good to do this to tackle social disadvantage, and that in itself was a good thing to do. But they also reported being motivated by a need to achieve financial efficiencies and inform tough decisions about the allocation of resources that they just have to make. So that was something else that really came through and I think is really important. I'm sorry this is such a whirlwind tour, but please do come back to me with questions and clarification, not just at the end of this session, but in general. My contact details are in the slides, so you'll have those. So there are 6 key steps to implementing the duty, and I'm going to take you through them in a minute. But as a starting point for implementation, what's really important is that organisations do a stock take of what they are or are not already doing to meet the spirit of the socioeconomic duty, because there might be practices that you're already doing. And we're going to have a think about that in a little bit and do an activity around it. So we'll come back to that once we look at some of these key practical steps. And again, I'm going to ask Noel to circulate these slides, so don't worry about taking notes. So the first ingredient is the idea of impact assessments. In the guide, we've included these questions, which are drawn from the Fair Scotland duty. As I said, Scotland have already implemented the socioeconomic duty across the country. And in doing so, they created the Fair Scotland duty guide, which talks about how to practically implement it. So these are the questions that were included in it. And of course, these are a floor, not a ceiling. So these are a good base on which to work, but you might want to think about how over time you might develop them yourself or add more in. So don't see these as a limitation in any way. What's key here is that impact assessments can be used by staff as a tool to aid their thinking in the design stage of policy. The socio-economic duty, and I cannot stress this enough, should not be a bit of awkward paperwork that staff have to do once a decision's made, and it shouldn't just be a box ticking exercise. If that's what is happening, then the value of it really has to be called into question. But what it should be, and again, it's not a panacea, but what it can be is a tool to help foster creative new ways of looking at issues and to develop new ways to tackle them. So the next key ingredient that we talk about is using data effectively as a tool for decision making and accountability. And what we mean by that, this area is particularly important when, as I've talked about, budgets are as stretched as they are right now. In the guide, we explore the importance of not only the latest quantitative data, but also the qualitative data of lived experience of residents in the implementation of the socio-economic duty. There's so much more detail in the guide, but another headline for me on this point is the idea of shifting the focus on changes to outcomes rather than just it being about decision-making processes. The next point, and the third one in this, is about encouraging strong and visible leadership. And I have to be really honest with you, I was very surprised at just how much difference people reported that this ingredient made. I found it really surprising and a really interesting outcome from the research we'd done. So what I would say on this is, I mean, it kind of becomes more obvious once you think about it, because as with all change processes, there has to be visible leadership from the top. The senior management team and the council's political leadership has to communicate clearly and consistently why the socio-economic duty is a priority. Cross-party support should be sought to tackle the socio-economic disadvantage and to ensure that the duty continues on regardless of the political climate. Again, it's about mainstreaming it to make sure that it lasts. In addition, there's a need for a cultural shift, and cultural shift happens more easily when there's that strong leadership on it. So staff at all levels of the organisation have to feel both empowered and motivated to ensure that the work they do or the service they deliver is part of driving out inequality from their community. And for me, this is a really important point as well about the duty. People should feel proud to be part of this and should feel like they're getting power to make a difference. Again, not a panacea, but we see it as a really useful and really important and potentially really powerful tool. The next key ingredient we found when we did this research was the idea of principles of working in partnership with people with lived experience of socioeconomic disadvantage. I'm going to be very honest with you once again. At Just Fair, we ourselves are still on our journey about participation of people with lived experience and how we make that really an authentic partnership and not just something where, you know, we go to people with lived experience to get nice quotations or case studies that we can use for our evidence, but actually they're part of our process. That's something we're still working on. So what I'm saying is it's fine to be on a journey with this. It's fine that it's difficult, and this is kind of at the cutting edge of this work. So it's really exciting for me to be part of that and to be working on it and trying. And what we would say is that for success, it's really important that this idea of lived experience, cooperative working must be committed to and woven through all stages to ensure that you're working with people with lived experience of socioeconomic disadvantage. That will require you possibly to fundamentally alter the way in which you engage with residents affected by socioeconomic disadvantage, perhaps through a radical process of reimagining what expertise means or recalibrating your working process. But the knowledge about how best to tackle poverty and inequality by enacting the socio-economic duty is held by those in communities who have lived experiences of socio-economic disadvantage. And again, I'm talking about this as a radical process or a fundamental shift because that's something we ourselves are undergoing in how we work. And again, change can be scary, but I find it so exciting and so great to be part of that, and definitely feel like my knowledge and my experience of human rights has massively increased, and the evolution of my thinking has been huge. So I'm so grateful for that sort of work myself. The next is an engaged point, or is a related point, and it's about engaging with resident civil society and voluntary and community sector organisations, because we believe collaborative engagement should take place from the outset. There's loads more detail in the guide on this, but it's key that work should be designed and or facilitated by people with lived experience. And that includes things like training on participatory approaches and also problem solving. And at Just Fair, we often talk about this idea of 360 learning to make sure that when we are working with people with lived experience or with other civil society organisations, we're trying to make sure that it's not us just giving our learning onto them, but we're getting it back in return, and we're changing and evolving and learning. And then you'll possibly be glad to know the final step is about ensuring access to justice and monitoring impact and compliance. Collecting evidence about the impact of the socio-economic duty is as important or is really important tool. Evaluation is so important in terms of knowing what's working, knowing what's not working, although I obviously don't need to tell you folks that you're well used to it. Considering mechanisms to provide access to justice where there's been a failure to comply with the socio-economic duty and therefore socio-economic disadvantage is also really important, because I'm very into this idea that we have of critical friends in the voluntary sector, where you have people telling you honestly about where you need to do better so that you can keep being relevant and keep doing the work that needs done. I'm now going to go on to a new slide, and I apologise in advance for the teeny tiny writing on this, but again, I have this thing where I like to give you lots of information and then you get the slides afterwards so you can refer back to them. This slide looks at some examples of how different local and combined authorities have already voluntarily implemented the duty across England. So for example, in the north of Tyne, it's in their equality and diversity policy. Then the next example is from Newcastle City Council, here already mentioned. That's actually the wording of the vote that brought their voluntary adoption in. And then finally, Southwark they started by putting it in their constitution, but now it's also in their equality framework as they work to keep mainstreaming it through. And I think I'm doing really well for time. So
you've got four minutes left, Helen. You're bang on.
Yeah, well, 4 minutes to talk about my group exercise. I hope I will only need 2 minutes. I'm going to apologise again for that being such a whirlwind, but again, I'll give you the slides and just come back to me with any questions. So I said earlier that stock taking what groups and organisations are already doing was really important to see what changes you could make or how difficult this may or may not be for you. So regarding the key steps, and Noel, I can't remember, in Teams, when you go into breakout rooms, can you see the slides or not? I'll post them in the chat. It'll be fine. We'll figure it out. So stock taking is a really important first step. So using those 6 key steps in small groups, I would like you to share and discuss 3 things that you are already doing that you could do more of, that you're not doing that you could start doing, and that you are doing which you could stop doing. So we're going to take 15 minutes for this and then come back and feedback for 5 minutes. But could I ask that each group nominate somebody to feedback? Okay, so I'll pop the exercise in the chat, and I'll also put the 6 key ingredients in the chat so everybody has them.
That's great. Thank you very much, Helen. And you are spot on with 2 minutes to go. That was a really great whistle stop tour in terms of setting the context around socio-economic inequality, and then the benefits of the socio-economic duty, and the kind of, and importantly, I think, kind of the practical steps as well. And we're gonna, as Helen said, we're gonna go into a kind of 15-minute exercise between now and Q2, and then come back to share some kind of headline insights from that, and then an opportunity to ask Helen some questions that you've got. As Helen said, when we get into kind of breakout groups, do nominate someone who can feedback. There is also, as I put it into the chat, there is also a Jamboard. So do add those insights into the Jamboard on those 3 questions. So you're kind of what on the ingredients that that Helen has shared, and I'll share them out into each of the breakout groups so that you can kind of remember them. Yeah, kind of what are the things that you're already doing to tackle socioeconomic equality you could do more of? What you're not doing that actually maybe you could start doing, whether that's in your service or the wider organisation, and then the things that you are doing that maybe you could stop doing kind of as well. So I'll put the ingredients and the link into the Jamboard into the breakout rooms as well, but you should see in the chat a link to the Jamboard. So do have a kind of a free flowing kind of discussion. Do add to the Jamboard as well. I kind of suggest we're going to try and get people into breakout kind of small breakout groups. So it's always good to introduce yourselves. That probably there'll be some people that know each other and other people that that wait. So always a good opportunity to do that. And bear with me while I create the breakout groups, and then shortly you should be going into your breakout groups if the technology works. Right, so hopefully you should start going into them.